Hello and welcome. The year 1451, Dale Reckoning. A singular moment in time when prosperity turned to ash, when a thriving metropolis became a tomb, when the very earth beneath thousands of feet opened wide and swallowed hope whole. You know this story, perhaps, from legends, or from walking the rebuilt streets yourself. But you have never truly felt the weight of what was lost until you understand what Neverwinter once was. Before the mountains screamed, before the fire fell, before everything changed forever, Neverwinter earned its name honestly, and you would have felt this truth the moment you approached its walls. While winter gripped the rest of the Sword Coast in frozen fingers, this city remained temperate, warm, almost impossibly comfortable. The Neverwinter River carried heated water from Mount Hotenow itself, flowing through the city in a network of channels that kept the streets clear of snow and ice. Even in the deepest months of the year, gardens bloomed when they should have been barren. Citizens walked in light clothing while neighboring settlements huddled around fires. This was the gift of the mountain, though none could have known it was also a curse waiting to unfold. The city sprawled across the mouth of the Neverwinter River, where it met the Sea of Swords, a strategic position that made it wealthy beyond measure. Trade ships from Waterdeep, Baldur's Gate, and distant Calimshan crowded the docks. Caravans from the inland cities brought exotic goods through the high road. You could find anything in Neverwinter's markets: silks from Thayan, wines from the Dales, weapons forged by dwarven masters, spell components gathered from the Underdark's depths, books containing knowledge from 1,000 libraries. The merchants grew rich. The city grew powerful. The ruling lord governed from the palace with authority backed by decades of established order, and the people prospered under this stability. Walk with me now through the Neverwinter that was, before the flames, before the screaming, before the darkness descended. You enter through the Peninsula District, where the wealthy made their homes in elegant townhouses of white stone and pale wood. Manicured gardens surrounded every estate. Servants in fine livery hurried about their duties. The air smelled of exotic flowers and imported incense. Here lived the merchants who controlled the flow of gold, the nobles whose families traced their lineages back centuries, the powerful wizards who studied in private towers, wrapped in protective enchantments. At night, windows glowed with soft magical light, and music drifted from grand ballrooms, where the elite danced and plotted and dreamed of greater fortunes. The Blacklake district stretched to the northwest, taking its name from the dark waters that pooled in its center. This was old money, older families, people whose ancestors had walked these streets when Neverwinter was barely more than a settlement. Ancient trees lined boulevards paved with precisely fitted stones. The Moonstone Mask, a theater and entertainment house of some renown, attracted artists and performers from across Faerun. Nobles sponsored plays and concerts. Scholars debated philosophy in private salons. The district hummed with refined culture, with the kind of sophistication that comes from generations of wealth and leisure. You could spend a lifetime here and never see all its secrets, never hear all its stories. South of Black Lake, the Protector's Enclave formed the heart of civic life. Here stood the Hall of Justice, where the city's lord held court and administered its laws. Guards in the distinctive green and silver of Neverwinter's military patrolled the streets with disciplined efficiency. The enclave housed administrative buildings, embassies from other city-states, and the headquarters of various guilds that regulated trade and crafts. Fountains splashed in public squares. Monuments honored heroes of past conflicts. Citizens gathered to hear proclamations, to petition their government, to feel connected to something larger than themselves. This was the beating heart of Neverwinter's civic identity, the place where the city's soul resided. The Beggar's Nest sprawled to the south, and you would immediately sense the change in atmosphere. Narrower streets wound between cramped buildings. The smell of cooking fires and human habitation filled the air. This was where common folk lived, the laborers and craftsmen and small merchants who formed the backbone of any city. Not slums exactly, but working neighborhoods where life was harder, where money stretched thin, where people relied on community and mutual support to survive. Children played in the streets. Women haggled at market stalls. Men gathered in taverns after long days of labor. The nest had its own pride, its own dignity, even if the wealthy in their fine districts rarely acknowledged it. The docks district dominated the waterfront, a maze of warehouses, shipyards, and sailors' establishments. The constant sound of waves against pilings mixed with the shouts of dock workers, the creak of ropes, the bang of hammers from ship repair yards. Taverns here served rougher crowds, and the smell of salt water combined with fish and tar and sweat. Ships from across the Sword Coast and beyond tied up at the piers, their crews unloading cargoes that fed Neverwinter's prosperity. Merchants inspected goods. Customs officers collected tariffs. Pirates and smugglers operated in the shadows, because every port city has its criminal element, its gray areas where law and profit blur together. Beyond the main city, smaller settlements clustered in Neverwinter's shadow. Farms provided food for the urban population. Logging camps harvested timber from the surrounding forests. Mining operations extracted iron and other metals from the hills. These communities depended entirely on the city, sending their goods to Neverwinter's markets and receiving protection from the city's military in return. When the mountain exploded, they would feel the devastation almost as keenly as those within the walls themselves. The city's military maintained constant readiness despite years of relative peace. The City Watch patrolled streets day and night. The Navy protected shipping lanes from pirates. Garrison soldiers drilled regularly to maintain their skills. The Neverwinter 9, an elite guard unit, served as both special forces for critical missions and symbols of the city's martial prowess. These warriors trained constantly, maintained equipment of the highest quality, and took pride in their status as among the finest soldiers in the north. The many-starred cloak, Neverwinter's Mage Guild, occupied a tower in the Blacklake district. Wizards gathered here to share research, trade spell knowledge, and coordinate magical defenses for the city. The tower's library contained spell books dating back centuries, and protective wards layered upon protective wards made it one of the most secure locations in the city. Young mages studied under experienced masters, learning to channel arcane energies that could both protect and destroy. The Temple of Tyr dispensed justice and healing from its marble halls. Priests in ceremonial armor heard confessions, settled disputes, and tended to the sick and injured. The temple's influence extended beyond religious matters into the legal system itself. As Tyr's faithful advised the city's rulers on matters of law and ethics, their judgments carried weight in courts throughout the city, and criminals learned to fear their uncompromising stance on justice. The House of Knowledge, sacred to Ogma, attracted scholars from across Faerun. Its libraries contained thousands of books, scrolls, and manuscripts covering every imaginable subject. Sages spent lifetimes cataloging information, copying ancient texts, and preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Students came from distant cities to study here, knowing that Neverwinter's House of Knowledge held resources unavailable anywhere else in the north. Trade guilds controlled their respective industries with jealous efficiency. The Merchants Guild set prices and mediated disputes between competing businesses. The Crafters League ensured quality standards for goods bearing the Made in Neverwinter mark. The Sailors' Brotherhood protected maritime workers' interests and maintained the docks. Each guild had its own headquarters, its own hierarchy, its own internal politics. Together, they formed an unofficial government that sometimes rivaled the official one in influence. Life in Neverwinter followed comfortable rhythms. Merchants opened their shops at dawn. Workers headed to their jobs. Children attended schools run by various temples and secular institutions. Markets filled with buyers and sellers conducting the daily business of urban existence. Taverns served crowds throughout the day, each shift with their own character and clientele. Street performers entertained passers-by. Guards maintained order. Life happened, ordinary and extraordinary, mundane and magical. The accumulated weight of thousands of individual lives, creating the collective experience called a city. Festivals marked the turning seasons and honored various deities. Midsummer celebrations filled the streets with revelers. Harvest festivals thanked the gods for full granaries. Winter solstice gatherings defied the darkness with light and warmth and community. Religious observances brought the faithful together. Secular celebrations gave everyone else excuses to drink and dance and forget their troubles. These moments of shared joy strengthened social bonds and reminded citizens that they belonged to something larger than their individual lives. The Neverwinter River flowed through everything, literally and figuratively. Its heated waters kept the city warm. Its docks enabled trade. Its bridges connected districts. Its current powered mills. Citizens grew up beside it, played in it as children courted lovers beside it, threw offerings into it during religious ceremonies, and eventually had their ashes scattered across its surface. The river was Neverwinter's lifeblood, and Mount Hotenow was the river's source, though few considered what that truly meant until it was far too late. In the year 1451, approximately 23,000 people called Neverwinter home. Humans dominated numerically, but significant populations of elves, dwarves, halflings, and half-elves contributed to the city's character. A few dragon-born immigrants had arrived in recent years, fleeing turmoil in their distant homeland. Tieflings faced some prejudice, but found acceptance in certain quarters. Half-orcs worked primarily as laborers and guards, valued for their strength. This diversity created tensions occasionally, but generally enriched the city rather than fracturing it. Different traditions coexisted. Multiple languages filled the streets. Varied cuisines tempted diners. Neverwinter was cosmopolitan in the best sense, a place where differences added flavor rather than causing conflict. Lord Hugo Babris governed the city in 1451, though his authority existed somewhat in the shadow of Netherese influence. The great floating cities of returned Netheril had agents throughout the Sword Coast, and Neverwinter was no exception. The warlord Herzgo Alegni held considerable sway in the city's affairs. His shadow presence felt even when he was not directly visible. This could suggest that Neverwinter's independence had become somewhat compromised, that external powers were positioning themselves to exploit any weakness. The city remained prosperous and functional, but subtle undercurrents of political maneuvering hinted at instability beneath the surface. The Alagandar dynasty, which had ruled Neverwinter for generations following Lord Nasher Alagandar's long reign, had ended at some point in the years following the spell plague. Lord Nasher himself had died during those chaotic times when Mistrafell and magic itself went mad. His descendants had continued the family's governance, but by 1451, the bloodline's hold on power had apparently weakened or ended, whether through death, displacement, or voluntary abdication, remains unclear in the historical record. But the throne that the Alagandars had held for so long was no longer theirs. This transition, whatever its exact nature, may have contributed to the political vulnerability that allowed Netherese influence to grow. This was the Neverwinter that existed in 1451, Dale Reckoning. This was the city that called itself the Jewel of the North, without irony or exaggeration. This was the place where 23,000 people lived and worked and loved and dreamed, where they raised children and built businesses and created art, where they felt prosperous and hopeful about the future, despite the political complications that shadowed their government. This was what stood before the mountain screamed. You need to understand all of this to feel it, to know it in your bones, because only then can you truly comprehend what was lost. Only when you walk these streets in your mind, smell these smells, hear these sounds, feel this warmth, can you understand the magnitude of what happened next. Only when you know the Neverwinter that was, can you feel the full weight of the Neverwinter that would never be again. The mountain rumbled sometimes, gentle tremors that rattled windows and caused some concern, but no panic. Mount Hotenow had experienced periods of increased activity before in living memory. The heated river proved it remained geologically active. Many citizens accepted this as natural, as the price paid for eternal spring. Scholars at the House of Knowledge had noted the increasing frequency of tremors and consulted ancient texts about volcanic activity, reaching conclusions that suggested the mountain might be approaching a period of significant activity. Some priests received troubling visions during their meditations, divine warnings that something terrible approached. But Neverwinter had stood for centuries beside this mountain. The river had always run hot. Previous periods of increased seismic activity had passed without catastrophe. Based on this precedent, many believed this time would be no different. The signs were there for those who knew how to read them. The mountain would not stay silent forever. The pressure building beneath the earth would not remain contained indefinitely. The disaster approaching would not be stopped by walls or wards or hopeful assumptions. But people do not abandon prosperous cities based on scholarly concerns about theoretical dangers. They do not flee comfortable homes because of tremors that cause no immediate damage. They trust in precedent, in the pattern that tomorrow will resemble yesterday, that what has always been will continue to be. This is human nature, and it would prove fatal for thousands. Mount Hotenow prepared to speak, and its voice would be fire and ash and death and destruction beyond imagining. The jewel of the north sparkled brilliantly, never knowing that it was about to be crushed to dust. Section 2. The Sleeping Mountain and Seeds of Catastrophe. Mount Hotenow rose from the earth northeast of Neverwinter, a massive peak that dominated the landscape for miles in every direction. Snow capped its summit even in summer, a white crown that caught the sun's rays and glowed with ethereal beauty. From the city, you could see it on clear days, majestic and eternal, seemingly as permanent as the stars themselves. But mountains carry secrets in their depths, and this one held fire. The dwarves knew the mountain's nature before humans ever settled the region. Delzone explorers had mapped its interior centuries earlier, discovering vast networks of caves heated by geothermal activity. They recognized the signs of volcanic potential. The way stone formations indicated ancient lava flows, the presence of sulfurous gases in certain chambers, the unusual warmth that persisted even in the deepest passages. Dwarven records described Mount Hotenow as a sleeping volcano, dormant but not dead, resting but not extinguished. Ancient eruptions had shaped the entire region. Layers of volcanic rock formed the bedrock beneath Neverwinter itself. The Neverwinter wood grew in soil enriched by ash from eruptions thousands of years past. The river's course followed channels created by volcanic processes in ages so distant that even elven memory failed to recall them. Geologists who studied the area could read this history in stone layers, in the way certain rock formations stacked upon each other, in the chemical composition of minerals found throughout the region. The evidence spoke clearly to those trained to interpret it. This land was born of fire, and fire still lived within it. But dormancy creates complacency. Centuries passed without major incident. Generations lived and died, never seeing the mountain do anything more threatening than occasionally rumble or release steam from vents high on its slopes. The heated water that made Neverwinter so comfortable seemed like pure benefit, a natural gift that required no payment, no sacrifice, no caution. The river's warmth came from fire elementals living under Mount Hotenow in the Neverwinter Hills. These elemental beings kept the waters perpetually temperate, creating the mild climate that gave the city its name. Citizens accepted this as simply the way things were, forgetting that gifts from the earth often carry hidden costs. The spell plague changed everything, though the connection between that ancient catastrophe and the eruption to come would not become clear until years after both events had passed. In 1385, Dale reckoning the year of blue fire, the goddess Mystra died and the spell plague began. The weave that channeled magical energy throughout the world unraveled. Reality itself became unstable. Blue fire swept across Faerun, transforming landscapes, killing millions, breaking the very laws that governed existence. The spell plague affected the landscape catastrophically, making the ground rumble and heave up and down like the surface of the sea. Curtains of blue flame swept the land, reshaping it by cutting crevasses or lifting and sculpting plains into hills and ridges. Earthquakes shook the Sword Coast as tectonic systems destabilized. Mountains shifted. Valleys opened where none had existed before. Shards of earth wrenched themselves free and became earth motes, floating islands torn from the ground by the reality warping effects. Creatures and individuals who came into contact with the spell plague risked being killed or being warped by its energies, becoming plague-changed. This entailed massive physical mutations and often a complete loss of sanity, sometimes bestowing terrible powers on the afflicted. Those who came into contact with weaker versions of the spell plague were sometimes fortunate enough to escape with only a spell scar, which could also grant potent magical abilities. These plague-changed creatures would haunt the wilderness around Neverwinter for decades to come. Beneath Mount Hotenow, ancient containment systems that had maintained stability for millennia began to fail. This suggests that magical bindings weakened under the spell plague's reality warping effects. Physical structures likely cracked under stresses they were no longer properly reinforced to handle. The delicate balance that had kept catastrophic forces contained started to deteriorate, though the process was gradual enough that immediate disaster did not follow. The mountains started speaking in a new voice over the decades that followed. Tremors increased in frequency and intensity. Steam vents that had released gentle wisps now roared with superheated vapor. Sulfur smells drifted down to Neverwinter on certain winds, strong enough that citizens noticed and complained. Small earthquakes rattled dishes and cracked walls. Animals behaved strangely, birds abandoning nests, deer fleeing to regions farther from the mountain, dogs howling at night for no apparent reason. Scholars at the House of Knowledge began researching volcanic activity with increasing concern. They consulted ancient texts, compared current conditions to historical records, and reached conclusions suggesting the mountain might be approaching a period of significant activity. The signs were there for anyone trained to read them. The mountain appeared to be waking from its long dormancy, though predicting exactly when or how severely remained impossible with the knowledge available to them. They presented their findings to the city's rulers, explaining the potential danger and recommending preparations at minimum. The priests of Grumbar, god of earth and stone, felt the mountain's distress through their divine connection to elemental forces. In their meditations, they sensed instability deep below, perceived the mountain's growing restlessness. They too warned the city's leaders, speaking of omens and divine visions, suggesting that great change approached. But warnings about potential future disasters rarely inspire immediate action when weighed against present concerns. And Neverwinter continued its daily existence without major defensive preparations. What almost no one knew was that ancient Gauntlegrim lay beneath the mountain, the lost capital city of the dwarven nation of Delzone. This was no ordinary ruin, but a place of tremendous power and equally tremendous danger. The dwarves who had built Gauntlegrim millennia ago had discovered something deep beneath the earth, something that required containing rather than destroying, because destruction was beyond even their considerable abilities. A fire primordial, an ancient being of almost godlike power, had been imprisoned there in ages past. Primordials were entities of such fundamental strength that they had warred against the gods themselves in the dawn times of creation. They embodied elemental forces in their purest, most destructive forms. This primordial represented fire in its absolute essence, rage, and heat, and consuming destruction given consciousness and will. The ancient Delzone dwarves had constructed an elaborate prison using both physical engineering and powerful magic to contain it. And they had built the Forge of Gauntlegrim, a system that could channel small amounts of its power for crafting legendary items while maintaining imprisonment. As long as the containment systems functioned properly and the forge remained inactive, the primordial stayed bound and the mountain stayed dormant. Its presence was the actual source of Mount Hotenow's volcanic nature, its imprisoned rage heating the rock around it, creating the geothermal systems that made the region what it was. The heated Neverwinter River ultimately resulted from its contained power, channeled through the fire elementals that dwelt in the mountain. The river's warmth was a benefit drawn from a source of potential apocalyptic destruction. But Gauntlegrim had been lost for centuries, its location forgotten even among dwarves, its systems unmaintained. Based on what we know about the spell plague's effects on magical systems, we can reasonably infer that it damaged the magical components of the primordial's prison, creating vulnerabilities in containment that had held firm for thousands of years. The primordial's power began leaking more freely into the surrounding rock, gradually at first, but accelerating over time. Each tremor, each steam release represented another incremental failure in the ancient dwarven engineering that kept it bound. In the years leading up to 1451, various forces took interest in the region for their own purposes. The Red Wizards of Thay, particularly Silura Salm and the Lik Vailindra Shadowmantle, established hidden operations in the area. They had been charged by Shas-Tam, the Lik ruler of Thay, to create a dread ring, an area of concentrated necromantic power that could produce countless undead minions. A major disaster creating mass casualties would serve this purpose perfectly, providing both the death energy and the corpses needed for such a project. The Thayans discovered Gauntlegrim's location, or at least learned enough about its existence to make use of it. They recognized that the primordial forge, if activated improperly or without the necessary containment protocols, could serve as a weapon of unimaginable destructive power. The evidence suggests they developed a deliberate plan to trigger catastrophic eruption by awakening the primordial or releasing enough of its power to cause volcanic catastrophe. In 1451, the Thayan plot reached its culmination. The elf warrior Daliasin Fel, who had been charged by Shas-Tam to assist in creating the Dread Ring, worked with the vampire Corvin Dorkri and others to penetrate Gauntlegrim. They recruited or manipulated the mercenary Drow Jarlaxle and his dwarven companion Athragate, whose heritage as a Delzone dwarf gave him access to the ancient city's mechanisms. Vailindra Shadowmantle accompanied them on this expedition. The group made their way through the tunnels to Gauntlegrim, encountering dwarf ghosts that still haunted the ruins. Their goal was the forge of Gauntlegrim at the center of the city, the mechanism that both contained and channeled the primordial's power, unknown to some members of the party. This was not merely an exploration, but a deliberate act of sabotage orchestrated by the Thayans. When they reached the forge chamber, Silura Salm arrived with reinforcements and revealed her true intentions. Using hypnotic powers, Dorkry and Silura coerced Athrigate, making him believe that the Gauntlegrim ghosts wanted him to activate the forge. Under this mental domination, the dwarf threw the lever that reactivated the ancient mechanism. This action had catastrophic consequences that likely even the Thayans had not fully anticipated. The forge's activation without proper protocols released the fire primordial. The ancient being briefly awakened from millennia of imprisonment and, enraged by its confinement, unleashed a burst of elemental fire energy so powerful that it forced the immediate and violent eruption of Mount Hotenow. Vast amounts of its fury surged into the mountain's geological systems. Magma superheated beyond normal volcanic temperatures. Pressure spiked to levels that no stone barrier could withstand. The mountain reached critical failure in moments. Dorkry, Vailindra, and Silura made their escape before the full consequences manifested. Jarlaxle, Athrigate, and Dahlia also fled back toward Luskan. Behind them, the primordial's rage vented itself in the only direction it could, upward through Mount Hotenow. The volcano exploded with a violence born not merely of geological forces, but of an ancient being's deliberate fury, targeting living beings with what might be interpreted as malice. Elsewhere in the region, King Brunner Battlehammer had been searching for Gauntlegrim, following legends and clues. He was not present during the forge's activation and the initial catastrophe, but he would witness its aftermath and, years later, return to attempt sealing the primordial once more. The exact moment of eruption came on the 29th day of Elaint, 1451, Dale Reckoning. The mountain had been rumbling more intensely than usual that day. Some citizens reported feeling multiple earthquakes, strong enough that loose objects fell from shelves. Deep beneath the earth, in Gauntlegrim's forge chamber, a lever was thrown. A primordial screamed its rage, and Mount Hotenow answered with fire. 23,000 people in Neverwinter were about to learn that the comfortable warmth they had enjoyed for generations came with a price that had been accumulating for millennia. And that price was now due in full, to be paid in an instant of volcanic fury that would devastate their city. Section 3. The day fire rained from the sky. The morning of the 29th day of Elaint, the year of knowledge unearthed, began like any other morning in Neverwinter. Merchants opened their shops. Dockworkers reported for the early shift as ships arrived with the tide. Children complained about waking up for school while their parents prepared breakfast. Guards changed shifts at the walls. The city moved through its familiar rhythms, 23,000 people conducting the ordinary business of living, completely unaware that they had mere hours left before everything changed forever. The first sign came at mid-morning, though few recognized it as such. A deep rumble rolled through the earth, stronger than the tremor's citizens had grown somewhat accustomed to over recent years. Dishes rattled in cupboards, windows shook in their frames. People paused in their activities, looking at each other with concern that quickly faded when the shaking stopped after several seconds. Just another tremor. Nothing to worry about. Everyone went back to work, to shopping, to whatever they had been doing. But you would have noticed, if you had been paying attention, that the animals knew better. Dogs throughout the city began howling and would not stop despite their owners' attempts to quiet them. Horses in stables stamped and whinnied nervously. Birds took flight in massive flocks, abandoning the city in black clouds that darkened the sky. Rats poured from sewers and basement storage areas, flooding through streets in numbers that made witnesses step back in disgust and confusion. The creatures of Neverwinter were fleeing, following instincts millions of years old that told them catastrophe approached. At the many-starred cloak tower, magical wards designed to detect dangerous magic suddenly blazed with warning light. Apprentice wizards rushed to alert their masters, who quickly cast divination spells to identify the threat. What they sensed made their blood run cold. Enormous magical energies were erupting beneath Mount Hotenow, power levels that exceeded anything in their experience. This was not normal magic, but something primal, elemental, ancient beyond measure. They sent urgent messages to the Hall of Justice, to Lord Babris, to anyone who might coordinate a response. But events were already beyond anyone's ability to prevent or control. At the Temple of Grumbar, priests collapsed during their morning prayers, overwhelmed by visions of fire and destruction sent by their god. When they recovered enough to speak, they delivered the same message with desperate urgency. The mountain was erupting. Everyone needed to evacuate immediately. There was no time left for preparation or careful planning. Run now or die. Some acolytes rushed into the streets to spread this warning, while others began organizing what evacuation they could manage with mere minutes of notice. Deep beneath the earth in Lost Gauntlegrim, Athrogate threw the lever that activated the primordial forge. The fire primordial, briefly awakened from millennia of containment, screamed its rage and released a surge of elemental fire power so vast it forced immediate catastrophic eruption. The mountain could not contain what the primordial unleashed. The stone barriers failed, the pressure released, and Mount Hotenow exploded. At exactly 3 bells past noon, the mountain erupted with violence born not merely of geological forces, but of an ancient being's deliberate fury. The sound was beyond anything human ears were meant to experience, a roar that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the sky, from everywhere at once. Citizens throughout Neverwinter clapped hands over their ears, screaming without being able to hear their own voices. Windows shattered from the acoustic pressure. Walls cracked. The very air vibrated with such intensity that some people fell to their knees, unable to maintain balance. This was the sound of a mountain tearing itself apart, of forces so vast they reduced human comprehension to insignificance. A portion of Mount Hotenow's peak exploded with such force that the detonation could be heard for miles. Millions of tons of rock that had stood for millennia simply ceased to exist, vaporized by heat beyond imagining, or blown outward in fragments. A column of ash and superheated gas erupted upward, rising so quickly that witnesses could see it climbing, could watch it punch through the clouds and continue ascending until it reached heights where the sky turns dark even in daylight. The eruption column spread outward at its top, creating a mushroom shape visible for hundreds of miles in every direction. Sailors on the Sea of Swords watched in horror as the pillar rose above the horizon. Merchants on the high road, miles from Neverwinter, stopped their wagons and stared in disbelief at the impossibly tall cloud of ash dominating the sky. In cities throughout the Sword Coast, people looked toward Neverwinter and knew something terrible had happened, even if they could not yet comprehend the scale. But the worst horror was what came down, not what went up. Lava and superheated ash poured across Neverwinter like an avalanche. Pyroclastic flows, avalanches of superheated gas and pulverized rock, rushed down the mountain slopes at devastating speeds. These flows were not like normal wind or water. They were mixtures of solid, liquid, and gas, heated to temperatures that could melt metal, moving with the mass and momentum of geological forces. Nothing organic could survive contact with them. Nothing built by mortal hands could withstand their power. The eastern slopes of Mount Hotenow faced toward Neverwinter, and the pyroclastic flows followed that path with terrible inevitability. They swept through portions of the Neverwinter wood, and every tree in their path exploded from the heat before the flows even touched them. The thin barrier between the Feywild and the mortal plane was ripped apart by the catastrophe, leaving portals and extrusions of the Fey realms scattered throughout the damaged forest. Animals were incinerated instantly, their bodies reduced to ash before they could feel pain. The flows rushed onward, destroying everything in their path, leaving behind a landscape transformed into scorched wasteland. Outlying settlements saw the flows coming, saw death approaching faster than any horse could run, faster than any human could flee. Some people tried to run anyway, driven by survival instinct, even when rational thought knew it was hopeless. Others gathered with their families, holding each other in final moments. The flows reached them and erased them from existence in instants measured in fractions of seconds. Hundreds died before the disaster even reached the city proper. The southeastern and eastern portions of Neverwinter took the devastating impact of the pyroclastic flows. Stone walls that had stood for centuries proved worthless against forces that operated on geological scales. Sections simply exploded, fragments of stone becoming deadly projectiles that killed people hundreds of feet away. The flows poured through the breaches, flooding into the affected districts with unstoppable momentum. The Beggar's Nest, positioned in the southern portions of the city, faced complete annihilation. The cramped buildings that housed Neverwinter's working poor ignited before the flows even reached them, combusting spontaneously from radiant heat. People ran into streets already filled with fire, tried to flee in directions that no longer offered safety, because there was no safety anywhere in the path of the flows. Some made it a few dozen feet before being overtaken. Others died in their homes, in their beds, clutching children who would never grow up. The nest ceased to exist as a living neighborhood. Its entire area would later be consumed when the chasm opened. The Arcanist Quarter, where wizards and scholars had made their homes, suffered similar total destruction. Towers that had stood for generations collapsed or burned. Spell books containing centuries of accumulated knowledge ignited and turned to ash. The mages who had studied there, some of the most learned individuals in the north, died alongside common folk, their magic insufficient to protect them from geological catastrophe. This entire district would also be lost to the chasm. Other eastern districts faced devastating impact from the pyroclastic flows. Buildings collapsed or burned. Streets became rivers of superheated gas and ash. People trapped on upper floors chose between burning or jumping to their deaths on stone pavements below. The flows did not discriminate between rich or poor, young or old, guilty or innocent. They consumed everything in their path with the indifference of natural forces, operating beyond any concept of mercy or justice. The city core and peninsula district, protected by their more central and western location, were left mostly untouched by the pyroclastic flows. The flow's main force spent itself on the eastern sections, and the geography of the city's layout meant these more protected areas escaped the worst of that particular hazard. This geographical fortune meant these districts and their structures survived the initial onslaught relatively intact, though they would still face other dangers from the eruption. The Black Lake district to the northwest was also mostly untouched by the pyroclastic flows. Its location away from the mountain's direct eastern approach spared it from that devastating assault. The ancient trees, elegant townhouses, and cultural treasures that defined the district remained, standing through the initial catastrophe. The Moonstone Mask Theater survived. The noble estates endured, but the Black Lake itself, the dark pool of water that gave the district its name, became filled with debris, garbage, and ash from the eruption. But survival from pyroclastic flows did not mean safety from other volcanic hazards that affected the entire city indiscriminately. Volcanic bombs, chunks of molten rock ranging from fist-sized to as large as wagons, rained down across all of Neverwinter. They fell from the eruption column like deadly hail, and where they landed, they brought destruction. A bomb crashed through the roof of the House of Knowledge, igniting books and manuscripts. Another demolished a section of the Temple of Tyr, killing priests who had been organizing evacuations. Dozens more smashed into homes and businesses throughout every district, starting fires that spread rapidly through structures already weakened by the earthquake. Because yes, the earth was shaking, had been shaking violently since the moment of eruption. The resultant earthquake was catastrophic. Tremors made standing difficult and caused buildings throughout the city to crack and sway. Structures not designed to handle such stress began collapsing. Buildings fell, crushing everyone inside. A bridge over one of the city's canals broke apart, dumping the people crossing it into water that was rapidly heating to dangerous temperatures. The Neverwinter River itself was transforming from blessing to threat. Water that had always run comfortably warm now reached dangerous temperatures in some sections as the volcanic disruption affected the underground thermal systems. Steam rose in enormous clouds. Fish died by the thousands, their bodies floating downstream. People who jumped into the river seeking protection from fire and ash found themselves scalded in some areas, screaming as their skin blistered. And then the chasm opened. The earthquake triggered by the eruption was not merely shaking, but actual ground rupture as tectonic stresses released catastrophically. A great rift tore through the southeastern quarter of the city. The crack appeared in the earth, narrow at first, but widening rapidly, spreading across the devastated districts. You would have heard it even over the eruption's roar, a grinding, tearing sound as bedrock split apart. The chasm, which would later also be called the rift, widened to create a massive void that essentially swallowed the entire southeastern sector. What remained of the beggar's nest after the pyroclastic flows disappeared into the opening earth? The Arcanist quarter, already devastated, was torn apart and consumed by the rift. Buildings along its edges tilted and fell in, collapsing into darkness. Streets vanished into the void. Entire neighborhoods simply ceased to exist, replaced by a gaping wound in the city that descended into depths no light could reach. People fell screaming into the chasm as the ground beneath their feet simply opened. Some grabbed at edges as they slid down, clinging desperately to purchase that crumbled under their fingers. Others plunged straight into darkness, their cries fading as they dropped hundreds of feet. The fortunate ones died from the fall. The unfortunate ones survived the impact broken and trapped at the bottom in absolute darkness. But the chasm was more than just a physical disaster. It was a breach, a gateway between worlds. The opening exposed the plague-tinged depths of the Underdark that lay beneath Neverwinter. Strange ash zombies and plague-tinged horrors that had been trapped in the Plagueland below were suddenly released. These creatures began emerging almost immediately, adding supernatural threat to the already catastrophic natural disaster. The ash began falling heavily now, thick and choking, turning day into twilight and then into darkness. The eruption blanketed the city in volcanic ash. You could barely see 10 feet through the ash-choked air. It coated everything in gray powder that got into eyes and mouths and lungs, making breathing painful, making visibility nearly impossible. People stumbled through streets they had known their entire lives and could no longer navigate because familiar landmarks were invisible behind the ash curtain. The death toll climbed rapidly as the disaster compounded. Half of the city's population died as the eruption blanketed Neverwinter. Thousands of citizens perished during the cataclysm. Those who survived the initial pyroclastic flows in the eastern districts faced volcanic bombs, collapsing buildings, toxic gases, the opening chasm, and choking ash everywhere. Each hazard killed dozens or hundreds, and they occurred simultaneously, overwhelming any attempt at organized response. Among the dead were all known heirs of the royal house Alagandar. The ruling family that had governed Neverwinter for generations perished in the catastrophe. Their bloodline ended in fire and ash. Their spirits would later haunt Castle Never, unable to rest after such violent deaths. The loss of the entire royal family created a power vacuum that would shape the city's future for decades. Lord Hugo Babris, who had been ruling Neverwinter under Netheri's influence, likely died during the eruption as well, though records of his specific fate remain unclear. The governmental structure that had administered the city simply ceased to exist. Officials, administrators, and guards died alongside common citizens. The institutions that had maintained order and provided services were shattered. The Protector's enclave, protected by its more central location, and the Hall of Justice's reinforced construction, suffered damage but remained mostly functional through the initial catastrophe. City officials and guards who survived emerged to witness their city dying, to see smoke and ash filling the sky, to hear the screams of thousands. They ordered organized evacuations, tried to impose order on chaos, sent soldiers to save whoever could be saved, even as it became clear that much of the city was already lost. The Neverwinter Nine spread out across the accessible districts, each warrior leading rescue efforts where they could reach. They pulled survivors from burning buildings, fought through fire and smoke to reach trapped civilians, organized groups to move toward the harbor where ships offered hope of escape. They saved lives, certainly dozens and possibly hundreds, but their efforts touched only a fraction of those in need. At the docks, a desperate exodus was underway. Citizens flooded toward the waterfront, seeking any ship that might carry them away from the inferno. Survivors fled the smoking ruins that were once the jewel of the North. Merchants abandoned valuable cargoes and welcomed refugees aboard. Naval vessels packed far beyond safe capacity. Fishing boats designed for small crews took on dozens of passengers. Anything that floated became a potential lifeboat, as captains made split-second decisions between wealth and humanity. But many ships never left port. Volcanic bombs struck vessels at their moorings, punching through decks and hulls, starting fires or causing them to sink. The docks themselves suffered damage from falling debris and earthquake effects. The chaos of thousands trying to board limited vessels created dangerous crowding. Still, many ships did manage to escape, carrying survivors away from the devastation and spreading news of the catastrophe to other Sword Coast cities. Night fell on a city transformed. Mount Hotenow continued erupting, though less violently than the initial blast, continuing to pump ash and gas into the atmosphere. The eruption column glowed from within as lightning discharged constantly, creating a display both beautiful and terrible. Fires burned throughout Neverwinter's ruins, turning the devastated sections into a landscape of flickering orange light and deep shadow. The temperature remained dangerously hot, and toxic fumes made breathing hazardous anywhere within miles. The immediate death toll from the eruption and its direct effects was catastrophic. Approximately half of Neverwinter's 23,000 citizens died during the initial disaster. Roughly 11,000 people perished in hours, killed by pyroclastic flows, volcanic bombs, collapsing buildings, the opening chasm, toxic gases, or choking ash. The eastern and southeastern districts were essentially annihilated, consumed by flows or swallowed by the rift. Other areas suffered severe but less total destruction. The western and northwestern districts retained some structures and inhabitants, but even these areas were buried under ash and damaged by earthquakes and falling debris. Survivors who had escaped by ship looked back from the safety of the sea and saw the jewel of the North transformed into something from nightmare, a vision of destruction, their home consumed by forces that mocked human pretensions to permanence. They wept for the lost. They thanked whatever gods they worshipped for their own survival. They wondered what came next, how they would rebuild lives from nothing, whether anything would ever make sense again. The eruption of Mount Hotenow would continue for hours more of major activity, followed by weeks and months of lesser eruptions. The Thayans had achieved their goal of creating catastrophic disaster for their dread Ring project. The fire primordial had vented some of its ancient rage, though it remained imprisoned in Gauntlegrim beneath the mountain. And Neverwinter, the city that had called itself the Jewel of the North, lay in ruins, its people dead or scattered, its future uncertain at best. The city would remain mostly abandoned for many years, a ghost town haunted by undead, plague-changed monsters, and the few desperate survivors who had nowhere else to go. Section 4: Ashes, Ruin, and the Struggle to Survive. The morning after the eruption revealed the full scope of devastation in pitiless daylight. Ash covered everything, transforming what remained of Neverwinter into a monochrome nightmare of gray and black. The ash layer measured several feet deep in some areas, drifts that made movement exhausting and treacherous. Buildings that had survived the initial catastrophe now groaned under the weight of ash on their roofs. And throughout that first day, you would have heard the periodic crashes as structures finally collapsed, sending up fresh clouds of choking dust. The survivors who remained in the ruins faced immediate threats to their survival that had nothing to do with the volcano itself. Water supplies were contaminated with ash. Food stores were buried or burned. The air remained toxic enough that prolonged exposure caused respiratory damage. People needed clean water, needed food, needed shelter from the ash that continued falling intermittently as Mount Hotenow maintained low-level eruptive activity. They needed these things desperately, and the city's infrastructure that had provided them so reliably for centuries no longer existed. The Neverwinter River, once the city's greatest blessing, had become unpredictable and dangerous. The water ran gray with suspended ash and volcanic sediment. Its temperature fluctuated as underground thermal systems, disrupted by the eruption, sent unpredictable surges. Desperate people drank from the river anyway, because they had no alternative, and many sickened or died from contaminated water as their bodies failed to process the volcanic pollutants. Those who had escaped by ship spread across the Sword Coast, carrying news of the disaster to other cities. Waterdeep, Baldur's Gate, and Luskan received thousands of refugees, homeless and traumatized, possessing nothing but the clothes they wore and stories of horror. Some cities welcomed them with compassion, opening shelters and providing aid. Others viewed them as burdens, as potential drains on resources. Refugee camps sprouted outside major cities, temporary shelters that would become semi-permanent settlements as months turned into years and return to Neverwinter seemed increasingly unlikely. Inside the ruined city, the survivors faced a different challenge. Without functioning government or law enforcement, society reverted to its most primitive forms. The strongest took what they wanted. Groups banded together for mutual protection, often along lines of pre-existing associations like guild membership or neighborhood ties. Violence erupted over resources, over shelter, over perceived slights in a world where social restraints had dissolved. People who had been neighbors and friends before the eruption became competitors or enemies after, driven to extremes by desperation and trauma. The chasm that had opened during the eruption proved to be more than just a physical division of the city. A great rift known as the chasm ripped apart the southeastern quarter of the city. It was a breach a gateway between worlds. The opening went all the way down to the Underdark, where it opened on an underground lake. The land within the chasm proper was warped and twisted because of the plagueland located below Neverwinter. During the spell plague of 1385, when that catastrophe struck the region, a small plagueland was created in the Underdark below Neverwinter. All manner of plague-changed creatures dwelt in the earth moats and on precipices and caves in the walls of the abyss. Strange ash zombies and plague-changed horrors haunted the ruins. These were not merely random monsters, but deliberate creations. In the lake, at the deepest part of the chasm, a cell of the Abolthic sovereignty had their headquarters. The Aboleths used the spell plague energy trapped in the pocket below the city to create plague-changed monsters in breeding pits, mutating creatures with directed magical corruption. The plague-changed warrens, also known as the spell plague caverns, were a series of subterranean tunnels located in the chasm. These tunnels were a honeycomb connected to breeding pits, used by the Abolthic sovereignty to create plague-changed horrors by using the Symphony of Madness, a device or ritual that directed the mutation process. The warrens connected various underground chambers and were home to thousands of plague-changed creatures. These monsters began emerging almost immediately after the chasm opened, pouring into the ruined city and attacking survivors. The plague-changed monsters were projects and rejects created by the Aboleths, growing more powerful and efficient as the creatures improved their designs over time. Staying near the rift for too long also made people go mad, an effect of the spell plague energies that radiated from the depths. This made the southeastern quadrant essentially uninhabitable, a constant source of monsters and madness that survivors had to defend against daily. The dead began to rise throughout the city as well. Ash zombies roamed the region in the eruption's aftermath, apparently animated by the fell magics released by the eruption. These were not like normal zombies, but unique undead created by the combination of volcanic ash and necromantic energies. They shambled through ash-choked streets, mindless but dangerous, attacking any living person they encountered. More dangerous were the incorporeal undead, the angry spirits of those who died with overwhelming trauma, wraiths and specters that could drain life force with their touch. Valindra's shadow mantle, the Thayan Lick who had helped orchestrate the eruption, moved to exploit the catastrophe she had created. She had been tasked by Shas Tam, the Lick ruler of Thay, with two primary objectives. First, she was to restore a dread ring in the region around Neverwinter, an enchanted area made to steal away the souls of the living. Second, in addition to furthering Tam's agenda, she was to thwart the Shadowvar in the region, the inhabitants of a Netherese enclave that had traveled to the plane of shadow. The mass death from the eruption provided exactly the conditions Valindra needed for establishing her dread ring. She established bases in the most dangerous sections of the ruins, particularly in what would become known as the Neverdeath Graveyard District. From there, she commanded growing armies of undead, creatures she animated from the thousands of corpses left by the disaster. She conducted necromantic research and rituals, using the ambient death energy that saturated the devastated city to power increasingly powerful magic. The Thayans lured survivors and would-be rescuers into the rift and ambushed them. Vailindra wanted blood to supercharge her rituals and sought to gain priests of Kelimver as pets for her necromantic purposes. The Lick's operations made entire sections of the city too dangerous for anyone to enter, effectively creating a dead zone within Neverwinter's nominal borders that living forces could not safely approach. The Netherese forces, including the Shadowvar who had held influence in the city before the eruption, maintained interest in the region despite the devastation. They saw opportunities in the chaos, chances to claim territory or resources without facing organized opposition. Their shadow presence added another layer of danger to an already catastrophic situation, and their conflict with the Thayans played out in the ruins, with survivors caught in between. The immediate aftermath saw approximately half of Neverwinter's population, of 23,000 dead from the eruption itself and its direct effects. Over the following weeks and months, more died from injuries, disease, starvation, violence, and the countless hazards of surviving in a devastated city. The death toll continued climbing, even though the eruption itself had ended, adding hundreds or thousands more to the already horrific casualty count. Leadership in the immediate aftermath fell to whoever could claim it. The Neverwinter Nine attempted to maintain order and organize survival efforts, but they were warriors, not administrators. Various faction leaders from the merchant guilds, religious institutions, and surviving military elements competed for authority. Without a clear chain of command or legitimate government, coordination remained difficult and often ineffective. Each group focused primarily on protecting its own members, leaving many survivors to fend for themselves. Criminal organizations thrived in this environment. The Thieves' Guild and various gangs operated openly because there was no longer any effective law enforcement to oppose them. They controlled access to salvaged resources, charging exorbitant prices or demanding favors in exchange. They ran protection rackets, forcing survivors to pay tribute or face violence. Some trafficked in slaves, capturing vulnerable refugees and selling them to underdark races or other buyers. Crime became one of the few thriving industries in the ruins. Winter came several months after the eruption, and with it, new horrors. The ash that covered everything created conditions that were simultaneously colder and damper than Neverwinter's normally temperate climate. People froze in buildings that would have been warm before the catastrophe, because the heating system that had made the city comfortable year-round no longer functioned reliably. The volcanic disruption of underground thermal systems meant the river ran cold or fluctuated unpredictably. No longer the consistent source of warmth it had been for centuries. Disease spread through the camps where refugees huddled together for warmth. Overcrowded shelters with poor sanitation and inadequate nutrition created perfect conditions for typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, and other killers. Healers worked themselves to exhaustion trying to treat the sick, but they lacked supplies and space. The death toll from disease began to rival losses from the eruption itself. Another wave of mortality washing over survivors who had already endured so much. Some survivors simply gave up, surrendering to despair. Others maintained hope through faith, through stubbornness, through love for family members who depended on them. They woke each morning and faced another day of hardship because the alternative was unacceptable, because humans possess remarkable capacity for endurance when survival demands it. These were the core of Neverwinter's eventual recovery. The stubborn remnant who refused to abandon their city despite everything. The Black Lake District, having been largely spared from the pyroclastic flows due to its northwestern location, became a focal point for survivors. Its structures remained relatively intact compared to the devastation elsewhere. Survivors gathered there, establishing camps and attempting to create some semblance of organized community. This district would later become important in the power struggles that followed, serving as a base for various factions competing for control of what remained. Years passed. Neverwinter was a ruin for a while, mostly abandoned. The city remained in ruins, inhabited by perhaps a few thousand survivors at most, down from 23,000 before the eruption. Most of the original survivors had fled to other cities rather than enduring the constant danger and hardship. Those who remained were the most determined, the most stubborn, or those who simply had nowhere else to go. They salvaged what they could, defended themselves as best they could, and waited for something to change. That change came in 1479, 28 years after the eruption. Lord Dagult Neverember became the new Lord Protector of Neverwinter and hired Mintarn mercenaries to help rebuild the city. This wealthy nobleman from Waterdeep arrived with a fleet of ships carrying soldiers, supplies, and engineers. He proclaimed himself Lord Protector of Neverwinter, claiming a dubious genealogical connection to the Alagandar line as justification for his authority. Whether his claim had any legitimacy remained debatable, but he brought resources the devastated city desperately needed. Neverember got a mercenary army and brought order to the ruins, and then started fixing the place back up again. His arrival divided opinion among the survivors. Some welcomed him as someone with the wealth and organizational ability to actually rebuild the city. These supporters saw pragmatism as more important than questions about succession rights. If Neverember could restore order and prosperity, They would accept his leadership regardless of bloodline. Others viewed him with suspicion as a foreign opportunist, a wealthy lord from another city exploiting Neverwinter's tragedy for personal gain. Neverember brought mercenaries from the island of Mintarn to enforce his authority rather than relying entirely on survivors for military force. These hired soldiers cared nothing for Neverwinter's history or traditions. They followed orders, collected their pay, and enforced Neverember's will with whatever level of force he deemed appropriate. This made them effective at establishing control, but also created resentment as foreign soldiers patrolled streets where Neverwinter natives had once lived freely. The reconstruction efforts Neverember initiated were genuinely impressive from a practical standpoint. His engineers surveyed the damage and created systematic plans for rebuilding. His supply ships brought food, clean water, building materials, and tools. His administrators organized work crews and established wage systems. Streets were cleared of ash and debris. Buildings were demolished when too damaged to repair or rebuilt when salvageable. Slowly, painfully, a functioning city began to emerge from the ruins. There were still sections of the city that were effectively sealed off and vacant, or at least not used except for by the criminal element. Valindra's shadow mantle remained entrenched in her section of the ruins, a constant threat that Neverember could contain, but not eliminate. Taking advantage of chaos within Neverwinter, Valindra eventually launched an all-out attack on the rebuilding city. She had brought with her some red wizards of Thay, undead hordes, and even a Dracolic likely given to her by the cult of the dragon. Thanks to the efforts of local adventurers and the city guards, however, Valindra's forces faced defeat. Her undead hordes were slain. Her Dracolic soul was bound, and she and her red wizards were forced to flee to the graveyard district of Neverdeath. In the long term, Valindra was unable to seize control of Neverwinter, though she remained a persistent threat operating from the Neverdeath graveyard and other dangerous zones. Her presence and her dread ring project meant that undead continued plaguing the city for decades. The chasm continued spawning plague-changed threats that required constant military patrols. Large areas of the city remained too dangerous for reconstruction efforts or civilian habitation. The Sons of a Lagandar movement emerged years after Neverember's arrival. Nationalist rebels who opposed foreign rule and claimed to represent the legitimate interests of native Neverwintans. They conducted raids against Neverember's forces and supporters, particularly the Nashers faction, which used violent methods and controlled the Blacklake district for a time. The political tensions between Neverember's administration and various resistance movements would define Neverwinter's recovery for decades. By the late 1400s, more than 4 decades after the eruption, Neverwinter had achieved something resembling stability. On the whole, the city was thriving and working on refilling her walls. The The population had recovered somewhat, though it never reached pre-eruption levels. The city functioned as a trading port again, though not with its former dominance. Streets were safe during daylight in most districts, but the scars remained, physical and psychological, reminders of what had been lost, and warnings about what could be lost again if the mountain ever spoke once more. Section 5. A changed city and lasting scars. The years following the eruption transformed not just Neverwinter, but the entire political and economic landscape of the Sword Coast. Trade routes that had flowed through the city for centuries had to be redirected, causing disruption that rippled across the region. Waterdeep absorbed much of the maritime commerce, its harbor growing more crowded as ships that would have stopped at Neverwinter continued south. Luskan to the north, despite its reputation for piracy and lawlessness, gained new legitimacy as merchants had fewer alternatives for northern ports. The balance of power shifted, and cities that had once competed with Neverwinter now competed with each other to fill the void it left. The economic impact extended far beyond simple trade disruption. In the mid to late 1300s, Neverwinter had controlled much of the mining trade from dwarf and gnome outposts in the nearby Underdark, via hidden ways in various warehouses in the city. It also had a large fishing economy and did good trade in logging from the Neverwinter wood. All of this collapsed with the eruption. Farmers and loggers and miners who had depended on the city suddenly had no nearby buyers for their goods. Some traveled to more distant markets, accepting lower profits to cover increased transportation costs. Others simply abandoned their lands and operations, joining the refugee streams heading toward cities that might offer employment. Lord Daggalt Neverember's reconstruction efforts, which began in 1479 when he arrived and declared himself Lord Protector, continued for decades after 1461. As part of his new Neverwinter campaign, Lord Neverember worked toward re-establishing Neverwinter's trade and economy. The campaign proved far more expensive and time-consuming than he had initially projected. Every time his engineers thought they had stabilized one district, new problems emerged in another. Buildings that appeared structurally sound would suddenly collapse months after being declared safe. The chasm required constant monitoring and military patrols to contain the plague-tinged creatures emerging from the Underdark below. Lord Neverember invested a great deal of his own fortune to rebuild the city's infrastructure, buy the interest of merchants to send their caravans again to Neverwinter, and even ensure Neverwinter refugees had enough food and gold in hand. The cost of this reconstruction strained even his considerable wealth. He instituted taxes on Neverwinter's recovering economy, fees that many residents considered unfair given their already desperate circumstances. He sought financial backing from other cities and wealthy individuals, making deals and promising future considerations that would shape Neverwinter's politics for decades. The physical layout of the rebuilt city differed significantly from what had existed before. The chasm could not be immediately addressed, so it remained a permanent division and a constant danger for years. Some areas near the chasm were simply abandoned, left as ruins that became haunts for monsters and criminals. The defensive walls were rebuilt, but along different lines, enclosing less territory because Neverwinter lacked resources to defend the entire original footprint. The city that emerged was smaller, more compact, more heavily fortified, designed for defense and pragmatic recovery, rather than the confident expansion that had characterized pre-eruption Neverwinter. A major turning point came around 1484, 33 years after the eruption, when the chasm was magically sealed. This massive undertaking required powerful magic and tremendous resources. The sealing came at such cost to the city's coffers that some of its outer walls still lay in ruins, and several of its neighborhoods remained abandoned and plagued by monsters and brigands, even by 1491. But closing the chasm eliminated the constant stream of plague-changed horrors that had poured from the Underdark, making reconstruction in the southeastern sectors at least theoretically possible for the first time since the eruption. The population changed dramatically, not just in numbers, but in composition and character. Many of those who returned or newly arrived were mercenaries, adventurers, and opportunists drawn by promises of easy wealth or quick advancement in a city rebuilding from nothing. These newcomers lacked connection to Neverwinter's history and traditions, viewed it as a fresh start rather than a restoration. The culture that had developed over centuries, the accumulated customs and shared experiences that made pre-eruption Neverwinter distinctive, began to fade as the old families died or moved away, and were replaced by people with no memory of what had been lost. The sons of a Lagandar movement persisted as chronic resistance to Neverwinter's rule for many years, never strong enough to overthrow him, but never weak enough to be eliminated. They conducted raids against his supply convoys, sabotaged reconstruction projects, and spread propaganda questioning his legitimacy. The Nashers faction, which favored violent methods, controlled the Black Lake district for a period and ruled it with brutal tactics. Neverwinter responded with increasingly harsh security measures, martial law in some districts, curfews and checkpoints that made daily life difficult for ordinary citizens. However, by the late 1480s, attitudes began shifting. With the city rebuilding, a city watch known as the Wintershield Watchman was introduced, comprised mostly of locals rather than mercenaries, and the Neverwinter Guard became a dedicated military. Many of the sons of a Lagandar volunteered to serve in the Neverwinter Guard, causing Lord Neverwinter to depend less on the mercenary services. This represented a significant reconciliation, as former rebels chose to work within the system rather than against it, accepting that Neverwinter's administration, whatever its flaws, was producing tangible improvements. Lord Neverwinter still hired adventurers and mercenaries to help protect Neverwinter and train local troops rather than accept the help of the armies of the masked lords of Waterdeep, whom he felt had betrayed him. His relationship with his home city had become complicated, as political rivals in Waterdeep sought to undermine his position in Neverwinter, or questioned his ability to serve as open Lord of Waterdeep, while also ruling Neverwinter. Valindra's Shadowmantle remained a persistent threat, operating from the Neverdeath graveyard and other dangerous zones, though her power was contained rather than eliminated. Her Dread Ring project continued producing undead that plagued certain districts, requiring constant vigilance from the city's defenders. However, she never again mounted the kind of full-scale assault that had threatened the city earlier, apparently accepting a stalemate where she controlled her territory and Neverwinter controlled his. Trade began recovering as stability improved. Merchants from the new continent of Larrakond began to trade with the Faerunian cities on the Sword Coast some years before 1479. In Neverwinter, a group of traders from Tarmaloon, one of the Windrise ports of Larrakond, approached Lord Neverwinter in hopes of establishing permanent trade routes between the two continents. This opened new economic opportunities that helped offset the loss of traditional trading partners. Around 1491, 40 years after the eruption, Neverwinter was a city full of opportunities. As word spread that Neverwinter was being restored, merchants from both the north and the south became interested in trading with the city once again. Lord Neverwinter began forging a trading alliance with the restored Gauntlgrim in hopes of increasing the prosperity of both cities, while ensuring his advantage over the nobles and merchants from Waterdeep and Baldur's Gate. The ancient dwarven city beneath Mount Hotenow, where the catastrophe had begun, was being reclaimed by dwarves led by King Brunner Battlehammer, creating opportunities for mutually beneficial cooperation. Without guilds to restrict trade or construction, those who wanted to start a business in Neverwinter could simply do so, and those traders who dealt with basic products, such as foodstuffs, became wealthy just by selling their goods in the city. There was demand for many jobs, and those who offered their services either as workers or as apprentices had plenty of options despite the high competition. This economic freedom attracted ambitious individuals willing to take risks for potentially high rewards. Neverwinter remained in ruins for almost 2 decades, but thanks to Lord Neverwinter's efforts, the city began to regain its former glory by the late 1480s. Inns like the Driftwood Tavern and the Beached Leviathan became popular across the Sword Coast. The city was thriving and working on refilling its walls. By 1491, Neverember's efforts to rebuild the city proved successful, and Neverwinter had slowly been restored as a center of civilization in the Sword Coast north. The population had recovered to levels that allowed the city to function, though it never reached the 23,000 who had lived there before the eruption. Given all the devastation and population decline Neverwinter had seen, property values remained below what they had been in the city's glory days. This created opportunities for newcomers to establish themselves, but it also reflected the reality that Neverwinter was a diminished city, one still carrying the scars of catastrophe even as it rebuilt. The eruption became a cautionary tale throughout Faerun, a reminder that prosperity and civilization remained fragile against natural forces. Cities near other volcanic mountains reviewed their own disaster preparations, often finding them inadequate and investing in improvements. Scholars studied what had happened at Neverwinter, writing treatises about volcanic prediction and protection that informed policy elsewhere. The disaster entered cultural consciousness, inspiring plays and poems and songs that tried to capture the tragedy and ensure it would not be forgotten. Religious interpretations of the eruption varied depending on which deity's followers you asked. Priests of Grumbar claimed vindication, insisting they had warned about the danger and been ignored. Followers of Tymora saw the survival of any citizens as proof of their goddess's favor. Worshippers of Talos viewed the destruction as evidence of their god's power over nature. Clerics of Ilmater focused on the suffering and saw opportunities to demonstrate their faith through service to survivors and refugees. Each religion found lessons that confirmed their existing beliefs. The question of what actually caused the eruption was well understood by those who knew the truth. The Thayan plot to activate the primordial forge in Gauntlegrim had deliberately triggered the catastrophe. Athrogate, under mental domination, had thrown the lever that released the fire primordial's rage. The eruption was not merely a natural disaster, but the result of deliberate sabotage by forces seeking to create mass death for necromantic purposes. This knowledge made the tragedy even more bitter. The understanding that thousands had died to serve the ambitions of Thayan liches and their dark masters. The resealing of the primordial in Gauntlegrim became a priority for those seeking to prevent future eruptions. King Brunner Battlehammer and his companions, including potentially the legendary Drist Darden, worked to restore the ancient dwarven containment systems. The work was dangerous, technically challenging, and took years to achieve even partial success. Some binding mechanisms were restored, reducing the frequency and intensity of volcanic activity from Mount Hotenow. But complete containment proved impossible with the damage the spell plague had caused to the magical components of the prison. The primordial remained a threat, its power still leaking into the surrounding rock, still capable of triggering eruptions if the weakened prison failed further. Mount Hotenow would never be truly safe again, merely managed, contained imperfectly by mortal efforts that required constant maintenance and vigilance. The dwarves of Gauntlegrim committed to this task, understanding that their ancestors' prison had to be maintained if the region was to remain habitable. The Neverwinter wood, once a pristine forest teeming with life, was transformed. The eastern edges, where pyroclastic flows had passed, remained scorched wasteland for years. The barrier between the Feywild and the mortal plane had been ripped apart by the catastrophe, leaving portals and strange Fey extrusions scattered throughout the damaged areas. Slowly, over decades, pioneer species began reclaiming the devastated sections. But the forest would take centuries to recover anything resembling its former character. The Fey influence meant it would likely never be quite the same, as the mixing of planes created unpredictable magical effects. The political ramifications reached far beyond the Sword Coast. Neverwinter's destruction altered the balance of power among the Lord's Alliance. The coalition of northern cities that cooperated on defense and trade. Waterdeep's increased dominance concerned other member cities, who worried about one city holding too much influence. Questions about whether Neverember could legitimately represent both Waterdeep and Neverwinter, whether his dual role created conflicts of interest, introduced friction into an organization that depended on trust and cooperation. Eventually, Neverember's grip on power in both cities would weaken. Political opposition organized more effectively. His financial resources became strained, and scandals emerged about his methods and motivations. He would eventually be forced out of leadership in Waterdeep, though he maintained his position in Neverwinter longer. The city's government would continue evolving, developing new traditions while trying to honor the memory of older ones. Neverwinter would continue existing, continue changing, continue struggling with its history and its future. The survivors of the original eruption grew old, their numbers dwindling as years passed. They would gather occasionally to remember, to share stories of the city that was, to mourn again the friends and family lost. Their children and grandchildren would listen politely, but could never fully understand, could never truly feel the weight of what had been lost, because they had never known it themselves. Eventually, the last survivor would die, and the memory of pre-eruption Neverwinter would become purely historical rather than personal. Facts in books rather than lived experience. The eruption of Mount Hotenow stands as one of the defining catastrophes of the 15th century in Faerun, comparable in impact to major wars or the spell plague itself. It demonstrated that civilization remains vulnerable to natural forces, that prosperity and power offer no protection against geology and primal beings operating on scales beyond mortal control. The lessons it taught were expensive, paid for in thousands of lives and centuries of accumulated culture. But they were lessons that shaped how other cities approached disaster preparedness and risk assessment. You have walked now through the entire story of Neverwinter's destruction and painful rebirth. You have felt the prosperity of the city before the catastrophe, understood the forces that conspired to trigger the eruption, experienced the horror of the disaster itself, witnessed the struggle for survival in the aftermath, and seen the long, slow process of rebuilding something new from the ashes of what was lost. This is the complete arc of a tragedy, from glory through destruction to uncertain recovery. A pattern that has repeated throughout history and will repeat again, because mortals build their homes in dangerous places, choosing beauty and prosperity over absolute safety. The jewel of the North was broken on the 29th day of Elate, 1451, Dale Reckoning. What arose from the ruins was something different, shaped by trauma and struggle, rather than by centuries of gradual development. Whether it was better or worse remains a question each person must answer for themselves, balancing loss against resilience, mourning what died against celebrating what survived. Neverwinter endures, changed but unbroken, a testament to mortal stubbornness and capacity for hope, even in the face of absolute devastation. The city that exists today carries within it the memory of fire, the knowledge of how quickly everything can be taken away, and the determination to build anyway, to live anyway, to hope anyway. Mount Hotenow still rises to the northeast, still rumbles occasionally, still reminds everyone that the primordial sleeps, but does not sleep soundly. And Neverwinter goes on, rebuilding, recovering, remembering. A city that died and refused to stay dead, that was buried in ash and clawed its way back to life through sheer unwillingness to surrender to catastrophe. If you enjoyed this deep exploration of one of the most catastrophic events in Neverwinter's history, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps create more content exploring the rich lore and hidden stories of the Forgotten Realms. Share your thoughts in the comments about the eruption, about Neverwinter's recovery, or about what topics you would like covered in future videos. Thank you for listening, and until next time, may your own stories be ones of resilience and hope.